On this day, July 28th, in 1866, two of the most famous people in history met for the first time at the Congress of Vienna. As the two men entered the reception room together, they spotted the Austrian Emperor Ferdinand, who was holding court and having a private conversation with someone. Napoleon instantly felt uneasy. Who was this person? Why had he never heard of him before? The man's appearance was unremarkable, but there was something about his posture, his eyes, and the way he held himself that inspired a deep sense of unease in Napoleon's gut. When they got closer, Napoleon finally realized what it was. He had seen this face before, only once over a decade ago, when he had been just a young general starting out in his career, and the man was serving as a lowly private in his artillery unit. But it wasn't until now, standing next to the future emperor, that anyone noticed just how much the private had grown. It was no surprise that the Austrian Empire was recovering well from the war. After all, their army hadn't lost a single battle. It was also no surprise that the other great powers were keen to ensure that they didn't lose any more territory to Austria. But what was surprising was the level of influence the Austrians had gained over their former enemies, turning not only the French, but also the Russians and Prussians into staunch allies. But the man everyone was talking about wasn't Austrian or French or Prussian or Russian. He was Sardinian, the same as me. And everyone was asking the same question: who was he, and how did he do it? If you want to find out, then you're gonna have to stick around until the end of the episode, because we're going back to the past. Today, we're going back to 1788 to find out how Sardinia became a major player on the European stage. The reason why nobody recognized Sardinia is pretty simple. They hadn't exactly been paying attention to the island in the previous decades. In fact, during the period known as the Longue Durée, which basically means like a long time, Sardinia had been little more than a backwater. Sardinia is an island, the second biggest in the Mediterranean to be exact, and it's located just off the coast of Italy, between Italy and France. And despite being relatively close to some of Europe's most powerful nations, it had somehow managed to avoid being dragged into any of their conflicts. And the reason for this is actually quite interesting, because it has to do with the shape of the island itself. You see, Sardinia isn't one singular landmass, but rather two, with a stretch of water called the Gulf of Palmas separating the northern and southern parts of the island. This stretch of water happened to be incredibly treacherous, meaning that it acted as a sort of natural barrier between the north and the south. And this meant that the two regions could develop independently of one another, each with its own local government, laws, and customs. In fact, at the time, the northern part of the island was ruled by the Republic of Pisa, while the south was ruled by the Kingdom of Spain, a vassal of the British Empire. So although Sardinia had been an important trading post since antiquity, it never really developed into a unified state itself. However, in 1717, Britain would sell the southern half of the island to Spain, who would then merge it with their existing northern territories. This created a unified Sardinian state for the first time in history, but it wouldn't last long. Just 30 years later, the island would be caught up in the War of the Austrian Succession, thanks to the ambitions of the Pisan Republic. But as soon as the fighting started, it became clear that neither Spain nor Britain were interested in coming to the aid of their Sardinian possessions. Despite this, though, Sardinia would manage to hold out against the French and Savoyard invaders, even managing to defeat them in several battles. However, the rest of Europe had little interest in seeing a Sardinian victory, and so they all conspired to force Sardinia to surrender. They forced the Pisans to cede the entirety of the island to the House of Savoy, creating the Kingdom of Sardinia. The new kingdom was small, poor, and weak, and so no one paid much attention to it over the next few decades. That is, until 1796, when the French Revolution began to really pick up steam. As the French began their conquest of Europe, they came across Sardinia, which at the time was still ruled by the House of Savoy. Napoleon invaded the island in 1796, intending to annex it to France. but he found himself facing unexpectedly fierce resistance. Despite being outnumbered 4-1, the Sardinians managed to beat back the French, forcing them to retreat. This might have been the end of it, too, if Napoleon hadn't come back the following year with a much larger force. With twice as many troops as before, Napoleon easily overwhelmed the Sardinians, forcing them to sign a peace treaty which ceded Genoa to France and forced Sardinia to join the French Confederation of the Rhine. But in spite of being forced to join the Confederacy, the Sardinians remained true to their word and never joined Napoleon in any of his wars. Napoleon respected this, and so he left them alone, which turned out to be a good thing for the Sardinians, because after Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna was convened to redraw the map of Europe. The Congress of Vienna was made up of the 5 great powers of the time: Prussia, Russia, Austria, Britain, and France. And their goal was to create a lasting peace in Europe by reconfiguring the continent in a way that made war impossible. To accomplish this, they needed to find a way to weaken the French without completely humiliating them. And so they decided to do something crazy: partition France's colonial empire amongst themselves. They gave the Dutch a large part of the Low Countries, Prussia got some land in the east, and Austria got some land in the south. But the most valuable prize went to Sardinia, who were given the entirety of Napoleon's former holdings in Italy, including Genoa, Corsica, Savoy, Nice, and Malta. The Sardinians were overjoyed, but the others weren't. No one expected Sardinia to become a major power, let alone rule over nearly all of northern Italy. In particular, Austria was furious because they had been expecting to get Genoa, which would have given them control of the entire Mediterranean. As a result, the Austrians spent the next few decades trying to take back Genoa, but they were never successful. So instead, they settled for annexing Mantua and other minor Italian states to their empire. Still, they weren't happy about it. And so the Sardinians knew that in order to secure their new holdings, they would need to quickly become strong enough to resist an Austrian invasion. In order to achieve this, they brought in the best minds from all over Europe to help reform and modernize their state. In particular, they brought in a man named Giambettino Asso della Valletta to head their new Ministry of Finance. Giambattista was a brilliant economist who implemented a series of reforms to modernize the Sardinian economy. He introduced accounting rules for public finances, reformed taxes, established public credit institutions, and founded the Bank of Sardinia. These reforms turned the Sardinian economy into one of the fastest growing in Europe, fueling massive industrialization and urbanization across the island. At the same time, Gian Domenico arrived in Sardinia. The island's king, Charles Emmanuel I, sought to reform the military as well. He wanted to turn the ragtag collection of militias that passed for the Sardinian army into a modern standing force capable of resisting the Austrians. To accomplish this, he hired a French general named Alexandre de Laborde, who set about reforming the military along French lines. Thanks to these reforms, the Sardinian army would go from being a poorly equipped militia to being one of the most powerful militaries in southern Europe. Finally, Charles Emmanuel I wanted to reform the judiciary as well. He believed that the outdated legal system was holding Sardinia back from becoming a modern state. And so he brought in a man named Alberto Mario Pagano to reform the courts. Pagano would go on to introduce codification, which basically means writing down all the laws and making them publicly available. He also introduced the idea of trial by jury, as well as a number of other reforms that would make the Sardinian judicial system one of the most progressive in Europe. So, within just a few decades, Sardinia had gone from being a weak, impoverished backwater to being a major player on the European stage. But it was about to get even better because the next king of Sardinia would be Victor Amadeus III, son of Charles Emmanuel I, and he would go on to become arguably the greatest monarch in the history of Europe. We'll tell you all about him and his accomplishments right here on our channel. So don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching.